Hey, this is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. Today I'm here with the author, Mark Vlahos, author of the book Men Will Come, A History of the 314th Troop Carrier Group from 1942 to 1945. Mark, welcome. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Ben. Thanks for having me tonight.
So, if you could give us a little bit of your background and how you came to get an interest in troop carriers, how you came to be interested in writing, and then we can kind of go into the book from there.
Sure. Well, just on me, I was in the Air Force, served for 29 years, flew C-130, so I'm a troop carrier guy. So that's my interest in troop carriers. I've dropped paratroopers, the Airborne Mission, air, land, air assault, some special ops stuff, insertion stuff. I've done the full gamut of stuff. And I was in the 314th, and in my career, most of my career, my 06 command was the 314th. So in my career, I flew with three of the four original squadrons. Hence, in the 1980s and 90s at squadron reunions, I got to meet a lot of the original, World War II vets that were a lot of them still around and listen to their stories. And sadly, they're all gone now, and none of them wrote a book. And there wasn't a book about the 314th, so I just got called to do it. It was a calling, amazing. A labor of love.
That's outstanding. Is this the first book you wrote?
It's actually my second book. I'm working on my third right now. My first book was actually an Army book. It's called Winfield Scott's Vision for the Army. And this is just a little thing compared to what you got in your hands there. But what was neat, I took my thesis from my 06 War College, my 50-page paper, and I expanded it out into a 205-page book after I retired. So
that is very cool. So now, you referred to it. This thing is a weighty tome. This is about over 500 pages. And the thing that fascinated me about this as I was reading it was the amount of primary resources that you have. On every page, there are hand-drawn maps, there are photographs, there are manifests, there are timelines, there are excerpts from orders. How did you go about your primary research, and where did you have access to all this great information and the ability to reproduce it in the book?
Sure. Well, anybody who wants to do something like this, obviously the first place you got to go is to the service archives. The Army has archives, and the Air Force, for this case, the Air Force archives. So all the archives from World War II obviously are in microfilm now, and you have to request to get copies of those. And that's great. That is the squadron history as written by them. But I can just tell you, especially in 1942, in most of 43, the squadron histories, they weren't maintained that well because we were more worried about, trying to contain the Nazis and get established rather than writing about what we were doing at the time. But that's good stuff. That's my clock going off behind me. But the gold mine I really hit, there are personal collections out there that you got to find through families, who have them and own them. And luckily, the colonel who commanded the 314th the entire war, they were overseas, deployed with them in 1943, and commanded them till after VE Day, was a pack rat. He saved every piece of paper, every squadron op orders for the day, the daily orders, the bulletin board stuff, the paper they developed, the rag, and every piece of correspondence he wrote back and forth to his wife. There were 275 letters. I mean, he was a pack rat. 210 boxes of primary source material. All those copies of those orders where I got a lot of crew manifests at the University of Wyoming is where I found his papers. So I had to go out to Laramie, Wyoming for a week.
Now, that's outstanding. Now, one question I have is, from all that primary research and all those op orders and things like that you were referring to, you transition so well in the book to actual very personal stories that are told by the men themselves. I remember one story I was reading about guys returning from dropping troops on Operation Neptune, and the aircraft was severely damaged, and it appeared there was going to be no way that this aircraft could come down, but you had first-person reports from the pilot, the navigator, of how they were actually able to return to base. Aircraft might not have been salvageable, but they saved the crew. So did that come from personal letters? Did that come from interviews? How were you able to transition from your trove of primary but dry documentation to those really personal stories?
Well, again, because I was an insider, I knew the 314th and the families. I knew about 40 families, and through the sons, daughters, and grandsons allowed me to access copies of stuff their fathers, grandfathers wrote, and that's where a lot of those personal things came in. When the men had reunions after the war, is when they really started writing stuff down in the 1990s. And that was when there was a gold mine of primary source material, when these guys got together. And that's when they talked. World War II vets, they didn't tell their sons and daughters what they did, but when they got around their buddies at reunions, they talked. And that's when these guys started recording some of their stuff, 50 years later. And that's the gold mine stuff.
Very, very cool. Do you feel a particular kinship with the officer who had his files at the University of Wyoming? You've been a commander. You were in 06. He was a combat leader.
Yeah. What's interesting is I've got to be his son. Is 84-year-old. His son is a retired Army 06, West Point grad, 1959, and I established a personal relationship with his son, the son of the World War II commander. He lives up in Maine. I just cold called him out of the blue one day. This was 3 years ago. And he didn't know who I was. I told him who I was. I was writing a book. And, I wanted, if his dad was the group commander. And I just said, hey, your dad's going to be the primary player in my book. And would you support my effort? And then it was just amazing. The stuff first of all, he told me about the papers in the University of Wyoming. I didn't know they were there till his son told me. And it was a great story because all this stuff was in their garage. And when the colonel passed, Colonel Clayton Stiles, he retired as a two-star general, by the way. He stayed in the reserves, and it was in the Korean War, retired in early 60s, 68 from the military, but as a reservist. But all this stuff was in the garage, and when he passed, his wife tried to give it to the military, and they wouldn't take it. So it's just the Air Force wouldn't take it. So they found a letter on his desk from a buddy who was corresponding with the University of Wyoming, who had sent some stuff. So they just called up the University of Wyoming and said, hey, we've got all this stuff. Would you like it? They said, don't touch a thing. We'll send a truck. We'll pack it up. We'll inventory it. We'll take it. And here's something. The largest archives west of the Mississippi River at the University of Wyoming for anybody doing research.
That's good to know. That's an excellent tip. Was there any particular story that resonated with you about the combat experiences of these men, something you found similar to things you might have experienced, or just something that you didn't know about World War II pilots until you got to get into this documentation?
Yeah, I flew combat missions, night missions on night vision goggles, totally blacked out, landed in blacked out places in Afghanistan early when we were kicking in the door in 2001. I was actually over there as a squadron commander, but it's just when and we flew from Oman, Muscat, Oman, into Afghanistan. So it's a 4-hour flight in. We had to either land in Pakistan and get fuel and come home, or it's an all-night deal, just for an hour, insertion mission, once in combat. And but it's just reflecting after. It's funny when after the guys flew D-Day and all those night drops, they land, come back, they all go to the chow hall tent, get coffee. That's the same thing we did, and we just talk about it, what happened that night, because when you're doing the mission, you're not thinking about anything but the mission, and your buddies, and you want everybody to come back. And but just the men afterwards, having that coffee in the chow hall tent before they went to sleep, because they were going to fly the next night, just like we did. So it was like that pattern, that night flying pattern. I lived it, so that was neat.
No, that's fantastic. Now, this podcast is for members of the 82nd Airborne Division, the Signal Corps chapter of the Division Association. You've got some interesting associations with the division. You're parachute qualified yourself, aren't you?
Yeah, well, you guys would call me a cherry jumper, I guess. I went through Fort Benning as a cadet, but in our Air Force ROTC cadet when I was at VPI, Virginia Polytechnic Institute, now Virginia Tech in the Corps there. But I love the airborne mission, and C-130s were my first choice out of flight school. So my heart was in the airborne mission, and my younger sister, her company command was headquarters, 18th Airborne Corps, under General Luck, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Her husband was a company commander in the 82nd FA artillery guy, 105s, 105s, and he's a West Point grad. And my younger sister, here's one for you. She was one of 3 female battalion commanders under General Petraeus when we crossed the Berm in 2003 in Iraq.
Oh, wow.
So,
that's outstanding. That's a lot of airborne connection right there.
She commanded the MI battalion in the 101st, under Petraeus. So she retired as the 101st G2. So got a lot of Army in the family. I'm a C-130 guy, and we're kind of the pimple on the butthole, in the Air Force. We're not sexy weapon system. We live with the Army and the Marines in the dirt. So, it was great.
Oh, that's outstanding. Now, you and I have talked in the past a little bit. You said you're focusing on gliders. Is something about the glider riders or another research interest of yours?
Well, what's interesting is I just got into World War II 3 years ago. I was a Civil War historian for 30 years and a Civil War reenactor for 30 years. But when I first started, when I got the calling to write the 314th book, I dove into troop carrier history. I had no knowledge of the gliders and glider pilots. Glider pilots were embedded in the troop carrier squadrons. So I had to learn about gliders. My knowledge of gliders was zero, went from zero to megafold in 3 years just because to write this book. And then there's another great story in that. So I get on the web one day and I find, the World War II National Glider Pilot Committee, Association or Committee, and I start pinging them for questions and, for information for my book. And I got the president of this organization is Patricia Overman. She lives in Seattle. Her father was a glider pilot in World War II, and she's obviously. And finally, one day, Patricia goes, "Mark, why don't you just join us? Okay, then you can stop bugging me about asking me questions all the time. You'll have access to our database, okay? But then in turn, you can join our research team and be our 314th expert." So it was a win-win for them and a win-win for me. So I joined. I'm now in the research team, the Leon B. Spencer research team, and I am their 314th expert. So we do free research for families and relatives of World War II glider pilots. We have a database of all the glider pilots, about 6,000 of them. And so when a family, grandson, son, daughter, they want to, know, they find that box of stuff, medals and papers, and they don't know what their relative did, they contact us. We provide free research for families, so it's a way of giving back.
That's terrific.
And
that's a great
so I'm full up round in that. I've done about 40 researches, for when it's the 314th, comes to me as a task. There's about 12 of us on the research team and a lot of expertise. And some of them are in Europe. They're French. We have a Dutch guy, a French guy. They live right there. Where the gliders landed in Holland, in D-Day. So they're big asset.
The gliders are near and dear to my heart because when I was in the 82nd, I was in 2nd Brigade, which is traces its lineage to the 325. So learning about the glider riders was a big part of being a young officer.
Yeah, a lot of the Army units, obviously, World War II, they were glider-borne units. The 327th, all these units, the glider infantry. But if you can remember, after learning about the gliders, pilots, and the riders, glider rings have a big G on them. In the middle of the wings with wings. That G stands for guts.
All the way.
When you think about landing at night, not knowing there's a stone wall, a tree, a ditch, or a fence, that you're about to rip through your glider, it's just absolutely crazy. The night before we just went to day missions and gliders, we did nights, and took a lot of blood was lost in the learning curve.
Understood. We owe a great debt to those men. That is for certain. So how can our listeners get a hold of the book, Mark?
Sure. Well, it's at Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all the big places, distributors. It's published by Merriam Press, but it's actually printed and distributed at Lulu.com is the main seller. It's soft cover and hardcover, and you can just Lulu.com or Google the name, find it on Amazon, or Barnes and Noble. You can find copies of it.
All right, fantastic. Well, once again, listeners, the book is called Men Will Come. It's a history of the 314th Troop Carrier Group during World War II by the author Mark Vlahos, Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, Mark. I really appreciate your time.
Hey, you got it, Ben. Thanks.
All right, have a good night.
Cheers.